This leads me to the last part of the session, so the methods to predict wine heat instability, because so far I've been telling you about the mechanism, about how important it is to come up with new solutions, but it's also important to be able to tailor predictive tests to define how much bentonite, for example, a wine needs to be stable. This is very important, and in fact, there's a lot of action on this field, with many protein stability tests that have been studied, that have been proposed by different companies, by different researchers over time. So the methods available, typically, they have common approaches. They all aim to destabilize the protein. So you aim to destabilize the protein and so the wine in a short time, so compatible with the time required for a test. And how do you do that? Well, by applying heat, as we said before, heat the nature of proteins by definition. But other people have looked at other ways. So, for example, by making react with some chemical reagents the protein. So if you add some chemical which has destabilizing effect with the proteins, then the protein gets destabilized, and so as a result, you can predict the instability. By adding, for example, tannins, which will react with proteins, and in presence with heat, that will also cause haze formation, and so you will try to predict that. Some people have looked at quantification of unstable proteins with very targeted approaches, but by far, I feel like I can say, the heat test, so the application of heat to predict protein instability, is still widely used because it's a test that targets the heat unstable proteins. It's quite simple and is used worldwide. So what is a heat test? The heat test originally came from Ken Pocock, that in 1973 in Adelaide came up with this idea. So he came up with the idea that, okay, to destabilize the protein, I need heat, and he decided for 80 degrees after many tests for a period of time, and that period was set in 6 hours. But then once you heat a protein up, or a wine containing protein, you have the denaturation of these proteins, okay? The aggregation needs to happen at lower temperature. So the sticking together of unfolded or denatured protein needs to happen at low temperature. So he also tried different temperatures. They came up with 4 degrees of fridge temperature for 16 hours was sufficient time to cause the denaturation and aggregation of the protein, which will result in a turbidity. So in this case, you speed things up, the wine gets turbid, and depending on how turbid it gets, you can try to correlate with the amount of bentonite that the wine needs to be stabilized. The same author in 2006 revised this method by looking at comparing the ability to predict instability with wine which has been stored in a cellar. So they put a bunch of wine at the cellar temperature for 2 or 3 years, and they looked after 3 years how much turbidity this wine unstabilized or stabilized with the prediction of the test had. And by looking if the test worked well or not, they could, cut back or adjust the length, in this case, of heating required, which was brought down to 2 hours from the original 6. Didn't touch the temperature, didn't touch the length of the cooling step. In 2018, McRae from the Standard Wine Research Institute looked at that test again with a similar approach to the one used in 2006. They were able to revise that test, which was then defined in 80 degrees for 2 hours, followed by 20 degrees for 3 hours. So significantly reducing the amount of time to get the results from by saving 13 hours of the cooling step. So this is Australia. Okay, Australia has been leading the way into this test. In Europe, this with the countries that I'm more familiar with, I know that the temperature often is 80 degrees. That's maintained. It's much shorter the heating time. Very often, winemaker or winery lab, they use half an hour followed by 45 minutes at room temperature as an aggregation step, and then they do the reading of the turbidity. Even though, depending on the source you consult or the person you talk to, people have a lot of variation. So anywhere between 60 and 90, even more sometimes, anywhere between 10 minutes heating to a few hours. Also, the cooling step changes. Some people do it in ice, 0 degrees. Some people do it at room temperature. and for some cases it's very short, 15 minutes, some cases it's quite long, up to 1 or 2 days. So there's a lot of variation on the theme of the heat test. So how do you do a heat test? For those of you that are not so practical with this procedure, I'll try to summarize it with some infographic. So you take your wine to be tested, you filter it, and you filter it so that the turbidity of the filter wine, and you measure turbidity by this unit of measurement, turbidity units, NTUs, is below 2. That means that the wine is clear. So then you take that wine and you apply the heat for a certain amount of time. So you put in a water bath or a heating mantle for a certain amount of time. And you also record the turbidity of that wine at the time 0. So how turbid the wine was. Less than 2 it needs to be. If it's not, it needs to be filtered again. After you apply the heat at the temperature of the test decided and for the length decided, the cooling step is required to favor the aggregation, so the second part of the haze formation. So low temperature for a certain amount of time. And after this time, the turbidity is measured again in T1. So the turbidity at time 1, so at the end of the test, is subtracted. You subtract the turbidity at time 0, which would be 1 or something. And then if the difference or the delta between these two NTU is above 2, the wine means that the wine is unstable. So it's very simple. It works for every heat test. But there are many aspects that need to be considered for the test to be representative and to work well. And I'm trying to summarize some of those. So for example, if you do this test because you want to find out how much bentonite is needed to stabilize a wine, okay? So the first thing to do is to decide which bentonite am I going to use. And on the market, especially nowadays, there are many bentonites. They can be sodium bentonite, calcium bentonite, or mix of sodium calcium bentonite, and many variation on the theme. So it's important that the test is done with the bentonite that then will be used in the winery, because each of these will have a different ability to bind proteins. So you take your bentonite, you make a stock solution in water with stirring, so you let the time to the bentonite to swell. So the bentonite will hydrate and it will be ready to work. So you do a stock solution of 5 or 7.5% in water. It's important that people use always the same bentonite that has been used in the tank, because there's no point in testing a bentonite and then adding another bentonite. The results will be wrong. And also to be careful with the same preparation conditions. So same dilution of the stock, same rehydration time, same stirring method, same water type, and so on. So a lot of attention to details is needed to get representative and reproducible results. Then it's time to add the bentonite to increasing amount to the same juice or wine. So you take your wine, you do cylinders with the same amount, and you add increasing amount of bentonite. This means that the more bentonite you add, and the more protein you will remove from that wine. So it's important that the sample, whether it's juice or wine, is representative of the tank that needs to be treated. Okay, so sampling is also quite important. For example, having the same amount of solids. And the bentonite normally start from no addition to addition that can be 1, 1.5, 2 grams per liter, depending on how unstable the wine is. And then the bentonite, after it has been added and mixed, it needs to be let settle before filtering the sample again. So the sample needs to be filtered because it needs to be clear before going to the heating step of the heat test. So once the sample has been filtered, you take your nephelometer, you measure, you record the turbidity. That needs to be below 2, better if it's below 1. So for example, these 3 samples, you can see 0.5, 0.4, 0.3 NTUs. It's very important that if the number here that you get is above 2, you filter the sample again. It cannot be above 2, otherwise it will mess up the delta NTUs that you need to get at the end to take your decisions. So once you get a clear sample, you measure the NTUs, then you heat it up. You heat it up by using a water bath or a heating mantle. The temperature, as we said, is typically 80 degrees in most of the tests, but there are some variation, 45 minutes or 30 minutes to 6 hours, depending on the test that you choose. But even this step is critical because it's important that, for example, no water goes into the vials, and also that the step is always done in the same way. Because if you want to test samples over a repeat or a series of days. It always need to be the same temperature, the same length, the same volume in the vials, and so on. After the heating step has happened, there's a cooling step. This can be done in ice at 0 degrees, under cold water, at room temperature, on the lab bench, under running water. So there are, again, different ways of doing it for different length of time. The important is that the cooling is required because this is when the aggregation of the proteins take place. So the nature protein, they stick together and form bigger particles. That then is the turbidity that you're going to measure with the nephelometer. So this step needs also to be done always in the same way for consistency. Okay. After this has happened, so after you heated the sample, cool the sample, allow it to reach room temperature, then you measure the turbidity of those samples to which bentonite has been added at increasing level. And you can see here, for example, that you go 71 NTUs, 55, 38. The more bentonite you have, and the lower the NTU should be, because there's less protein that can denature. Okay. So by looking at this data, you take the number of the NTUs after heating, you subtract the number of the NTUs before heating, which are listed here in black, and you get the net delta NTU. So T1 minus T0, which is, you can see here, you can see that the only sample in which you go below 2 of this delta is the last sample, in which you have a 0.9 delta. That means that the amount of bentonite added in this vial was sufficient to stabilize the wine. Okay, so this is how you decide how much bentonite to add in the tank later on. It's important also in this step to measure with an nephelometer using clean vials, very clean, scratch-free, and careful about condensation. So, for example, the sample, if it does condensation on the outside, it will be read as a turbidity. So also this step needs to be fully standardized. So the key message that I'm trying to give you about the test is that the control over each of the different steps is fundamental. So it doesn't really matter which parameters you choose, while it does at the stage, but it's more important that you do them always in the same way and always with the same timing, temperature, duration, and so on. For example, it's important to know that the higher the temperature, the more haze you will get, because you will unfold not only the heat unstable protein, but also the heat stable protein. So the wine contains protein which are unstable, but also some that are stable. The more you heat, and the more you're going to tap into that reservoir of stable proteins too, which then will lead to overfining. The longer the heating time and the more haze you get, because you have more protein denaturation, followed by more protein aggregation. And also the cooling, equally. If you let the wine after heating to cool for a long time, the turbidity will increase and increase and increase, because the aggregation keeps going. It will change the speed, but it will keep going. So it's important to respect the right timing and the same time and the same temperature throughout.